When the police lights flashed across my driveway at 9:17 p.m., I knew this wasn't about noise complaints or paperwork. It was intimidation, carefully planned, delivered with badges and smug smiles. The HOA president stood behind the officers, arms folded, already rehearsing the story she wanted them to hear. She thought fear would make me back down. What she didn't know was that 72 hours later, every home she controlled would legally belong to me, and this moment would become the beginning of their end. 3 months earlier, I had moved into the neighborhood quietly, the kind of resident HOAs underestimate. I read every rule, paid every fee, and smiled through every passive-aggressive warning taped to my door. The board saw compliance and assumed weakness. They fined me for parking, for paint shades, even for a mailbox they had approved themselves. I documented everything, not out of anger, but because patterns matter when power hides behind paperwork. The night the police arrived, the officers were polite but firm. They said the HOA had reported threats, obstruction, and harassment. None of it was true, and they realized that within minutes. Still, the damage was done. Neighbors watched from behind curtains. Phones recorded quietly. The HOA president whispered confidently, believing public shame was the final move. I thanked the officers, closed my door, and made a phone call that changed everything. That call went to a title researcher I had hired weeks earlier, someone who specialized in buried clauses and forgotten deeds. While the HOA focused on intimidation, we focused on ownership. The community sat on land transferred decades ago under conditions the board never bothered to verify. One overlooked clause tied voting authority and asset control to a deed structure they had unknowingly violated years ago. For 72 hours, I did nothing publicly. I let them gloat, send emails, and issue fresh notices. Behind the scenes, filings were submitted, signatures verified, and a quiet correction moved through the county system. By the time the HOA scheduled an emergency meeting, the records had already updated. Control didn't shift dramatically. It simply changed hands. On the fourth morning, certified letters went out. The HOA ceased to exist as they understood it. Every home, every common space, every rule fell under one name. Mine. And none of them saw it coming. By the time the HOA board realized something was wrong, panic had already set in. Their emergency meeting was scheduled for 10 in the morning, but emails started flying before sunrise. Neighbors were confused, board members were defensive, and the president kept insisting everything was a clerical delay. I watched it unfold calmly, coffee in hand, because I knew the truth they were about to face couldn't be argued away. At exactly 9:02 a.m., the first certified letter was delivered. Then another. And another. Each one carried the same message, written in cold, legal language. The HOA's authority was suspended pending review. Asset control had reverted to the deed holder. Voting power was null. Enforcement actions were frozen. The document didn't accuse or insult. It simply stated facts, which somehow made it more terrifying. I didn't attend the emergency meeting. I didn't need to. Someone recorded it anyway. Voices overlapped. Chairs scraped. The president demanded explanations no one could give. One board member suggested calling their lawyer. Another said this had to be a scam. The treasurer went silent after pulling up the county database and seeing my name listed where theirs used to be. What made it worse was that this wasn't sudden. The clause had been there for decades, buried in the original land transfer when the community was first built. It required the HOA to maintain a specific deed structure to retain control. Years ago, they changed it to simplify dues collection, never checking the long-term consequences. Convenience had cost them everything. Neighbors started knocking on my door before noon. Some were angry, convinced I'd manipulated the system. Others were nervous, worried about mortgages and property values. A few were quietly relieved. I told all of them the same thing. Nothing was being taken from them. Their homes were safe. The only thing disappearing was an abusive layer of control that had overstepped for years. Around midday, the HOA's attorney finally called me. His voice was careful, rehearsed. He asked what I wanted. That question revealed everything. They assumed this was about money, revenge, or power. I told him I wanted exactly what the law already said was mine. No more. No less. By evening, the board resigned one by one. The president sent a final email blaming everyone but herself. The police report from the night before quietly vanished from follow-up. And just like that, the HOA that once ruled by threats and fines collapsed under the weight of its own negligence. I went to bed that night knowing this wasn't over. Because when people lose power they never understood, they don't walk away quietly. They come back swinging. The backlash started the next morning, right on schedule. When power disappears overnight, fear rushes in to fill the gap, and fear makes people reckless. My phone buzzed non-stop with messages forwarded by neighbors. Rumors spread faster than facts. Some said I was seizing homes. Others claimed the county had made a mistake. A few insisted the HOA would be reinstated within days and that I'd be punished for overreaching. None of that mattered. The records were clean, final, and legally airtight. By noon, protest signs appeared near the community entrance. They weren't organized, just emotional. Words like fraud, theft, and corruption were scribbled in marker. I didn't respond. Silence, in moments like this, is louder than any argument. Every hour that passed without a reversal made the truth sink in deeper. This wasn't a glitch. It was real. That afternoon, a second lawyer contacted me, this one representing a group of former board members personally. He spoke less formally, more urgently. He suggested mediation, compromise, maybe a shared control arrangement. I declined politely. Shared control was how the problem started in the first place. Authority divided without accountability always rots from the inside. What surprised me most were the quiet visits. Elderly residents, young couples, people who had never spoken up before. They told stories of fines they couldn't afford, threats over trivial rules, and meetings where voices were dismissed. The HOA had ruled through paperwork, but it had survived through silence. Now that silence was breaking. Late in the evening, I reviewed the police report from the intimidation call. It was still accessible, still inaccurate. So I filed a formal correction request, attaching video footage, witness statements, and the officer's own notes. Within hours, the report status changed. No charges. No follow-up. Just another failed attempt to control the narrative. As night fell, something shifted. The anger outside softened into uncertainty. People realized their homes weren't being taken. Lawns were still theirs. Doors still locked. The sky didn't fall. The only difference was that the rule enforcers were gone. I posted a single notice on the community board. It wasn't threatening or celebratory. It explained the situation clearly and invited residents to a town hall, not as subjects, but as stakeholders. Transparency is disarming when people expect secrecy. By the time I turned off the lights, I understood something important. This wasn't just about deeds or clauses. It was about what happens when authority forgets it exists to serve, not dominate. And the people who had relied on intimidation were learning that lesson the hard way. The town hall was scheduled for Friday evening, and by the time it began, the room was full in a way HOA meetings never were before. No one was forced to attend. No fines were threatened. People came because they wanted answers, and more importantly, because they wanted a voice. That alone marked the biggest change this community had seen in years. I stood at the front, not behind a raised table, not above anyone. Just standing. I explained the facts slowly, carefully, knowing fear thrives on confusion. I showed the original deed, the clause, the filing dates, and the public records anyone could verify. No spin. No celebration. Just truth. You could feel the tension easing as people realized this wasn't a hostile takeover. It was a correction. Questions came fast. Who would handle maintenance? What about dues? Could rules still exist? I answered honestly. Essentials would continue. Roads would be maintained. Shared spaces would be cared for. But enforcement would no longer come from a closed board issuing threats. Any future structure would be built with consent, transparency, and limits. Power would be earned, not assumed. Then something unexpected happened. A former board member stood up. Not the president, but someone quieter. She admitted they never read the full deed. They trusted templates, advice passed down, and shortcuts. She said the intimidation tactics escalated because fear of losing control had replaced responsibility. Her honesty shifted the room. Accountability does that. It breaks the illusion that power is infallible. Outside, a local reporter waited. The police incident, the collapse of the HOA, and the sudden shift in ownership had drawn attention. I declined interviews that night. This wasn't a spectacle. It was people's homes. Turning it into entertainment would only inflame what needed calm. Over the next 2 days, the legal fallout accelerated. Former board members received notices about personal liability tied to years of improper enforcement. The fines they'd issued were reviewed. Many were invalid. Refunds were calculated. The same paperwork they once used to intimidate residents now worked in reverse. The HOA president tried one last move. She filed a complaint alleging coercion and fraud. It went nowhere. The clause was clear. The filings were clean. Her authority had ended the moment she ignored the foundation it rested on. By Sunday evening, something rare settled over the neighborhood. Relief. Lawns were still cut. Kids played outside without warning notices taped to doors. People talked. Really talked. Without fear of being reported. That night, I updated the records one final time, locking in protections to prevent this from ever happening again. Because power without checks doesn't just fail. It abuses. And this community had paid enough for that lesson. Monday morning felt strangely quiet. No warning letters. No mass emails marked urgent. No footsteps of inspectors measuring driveways or peering at paint colors. The silence wasn't emptiness. It was peace returning after years of constant pressure. But beneath that calm, consequences were unfolding fast. The county completed its compliance review by noon. Their conclusion was blunt. The HOA had operated outside its legal authority for years. Enforcement actions were invalid. Liens placed on homes were questionable. And financial decisions made by the board were now subject to audit. What began as intimidation had opened a door no one on the board knew how to close. Former board members started calling residents individually. Apologies came late and awkward. Some sounded sincere. Others sounded scared. A few tried to justify their actions, blaming policy or pressure from above. But there was no above anymore. Authority had collapsed inward, leaving only personal responsibility behind. One resident brought me a thick folder of documents. Fines stacked on fines. Threats over grass length, trash bins, and window blinds. Another showed photos of damage caused by forced compliance contractors. Each story added weight to what was now unavoidable. Accountability wasn't optional. It was already moving. That afternoon, I authorized a temporary oversight committee, not to rule, but to observe. Volunteers from the community. Open meetings. Recorded notes. No decisions without consensus. Transparency slowed everything down, and that was the point. Speed had been the HOA's weapon. Patience would be its replacement. The media returned, louder this time. Headlines tried to simplify the story into a power grab or a legal loophole. I corrected them once, clearly. This wasn't about taking homes. It was about stopping abuse disguised as order. After that, I stopped engaging. The truth was already documented. By evening, the HOA's insurance provider dropped coverage. Without authority, without legal standing, they were uninsurable. That single action sealed it. No lawsuits. No appeals. No quiet reinstatement later. The structure was gone for good. I walked the neighborhood that night. Porch lights glowed warmly. Conversations drifted through open windows. For the first time since I'd moved in, the place felt like a community instead of a controlled zone. People waved. Some thanked me. Others just smiled. That was enough. But I knew something important still had to happen. Ending a bad system isn't the same as building a good one. Power vacuums attract the same mistakes if left unchecked. So the next step wouldn't be dramatic. It would be deliberate. I drafted a proposal for a new model. One with limits, clear exit clauses, and resident control written in plain language. No buried surprises. No silent clauses waiting to explode years later. This time, everyone would know exactly what they were agreeing to. Because fear had ruled this place long enough. And trust, once broken, can only be rebuilt slowly, in the open. The proposal went out on Tuesday morning, delivered the same way the old HOA once sent threats, but with one crucial difference. This time, there was nothing to fear. No deadlines hidden in fine print. No penalties lurking between lines. Just a clear outline of how the community could govern itself without repeating the same mistakes that nearly tore it apart. By noon, feedback started coming in. Slowly at first, then all at once. Some residents wanted no structure at all, convinced any organized authority would eventually turn abusive. Others argued for strict rules, worried chaos would replace control. Both sides were reacting to trauma, not logic, and that was understandable. Years under intimidation don't disappear just because the source is gone. That evening, I hosted small group discussions instead of one large meeting. 10 people at a time. Living rooms, not conference halls. Conversations, not speeches. People spoke more freely when they weren't performing for a crowd. They admitted fears they'd never voiced before. Fear of retaliation. Fear of losing their homes. Fear of speaking up and being singled out. Listening mattered more than responding. One moment stayed with me. A man who had never attended an HOA meeting before said he finally felt safe enough to care. That sentence explained everything. When governance relies on fear, participation dies. When fear is removed, people reappear. Midweek brought another twist. The former HOA president attempted to rally support for a lawsuit, claiming the community was destabilized without her leadership. The response was silence. No one followed. No one donated. Power, once broken, is hard to resurrect when people realize they never needed it in the first place. Financial audits wrapped up by Thursday. The numbers confirmed what many suspected. Excess fees. Unnecessary legal expenses. Funds spent defending authority instead of maintaining the neighborhood. The irony was painful. The very money taken to enforce order had been used to protect the system enforcing it. By Friday, a revised proposal emerged, shaped by real voices, not templates. It included strict limits on authority, automatic reviews, and an opt-out clause that allowed residents to leave without punishment. Control would never again be absolute. That was non-negotiable. I submitted the framework to the county, not because they required it, but because sunlight prevents rot. Everything would be public. Verifiable. Boring in the best possible way. Power thrives in complexity. Fairness thrives in clarity. As the week ended, something unexpected happened. People stopped talking about me. The story shifted away from who triggered the change and toward how the community would move forward. That was the goal all along. Real change doesn't center on one person. It decentralizes. The police never returned. The lawyers stopped calling. The signs came down. Life resumed, quieter and healthier than before. And for the first time since that night of flashing lights, the future felt stable. The real test came when things stopped feeling dramatic. No threats. No court deadlines. No emergency meetings. Just ordinary days. That's when you find out whether a community has actually healed or if it's just catching its breath. Power struggles thrive on chaos, but stability exposes what people truly want. A month passed. Then another. The temporary oversight committee dissolved exactly on schedule, as promised. No extensions. No excuses. That mattered more than any speech. Authority that knows when to step back earns trust faster than authority that clings on. Neighbors began solving problems themselves. A broken light got fixed because someone noticed, not because a notice was issued. A parking dispute ended with a conversation instead of a fine. Small things, but small things are where abuse usually starts. This time, they were handled differently. One afternoon, a former board member approached me quietly. Not to argue. Not to defend. Just to talk. She admitted she'd enjoyed the power more than she realized. The sense of control. The ability to enforce. Losing it had forced her to confront parts of herself she'd ignored. That conversation stayed with me. Systems don't abuse people alone. People choose how to use them. The county closed its file officially soon after. No further action required. That single line carried weight. It meant the nightmare was truly over. No appeals waiting in the shadows. No technicality left to exploit. Ironically, property values rose. Buyers were drawn to the absence of an HOA, not the presence of strict control. Freedom, it turns out, is attractive. The thing residents had been told would destroy their investments ended up strengthening them instead. The police incident faded into memory. The report sat corrected, unremarkable, stripped of its original intent. What had once been used as a weapon became just another failed attempt recorded in a system built to value facts over fear. People asked me if I planned to stay long-term. The assumption surprised me. This was never about ownership in the way they imagined. Control wasn't the prize. Correction was. Once that was done, the story didn't need a central figure anymore. On a quiet evening, I walked past the community entrance where protest signs once stood. Grass had grown back. The marker stains were gone. You wouldn't know anything extraordinary had happened unless you knew where to look. That's how real change settles in. It doesn't announce itself forever. The lesson wasn't legal. It was human. Intimidation works only until someone stops being afraid. Paperwork can be a weapon, but it can also be a shield. And systems built without accountability always collapse under their own weight eventually. There was only one loose end left. One final conversation that needed to happen. And it would close this chapter for good. The final conversation happened on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, far from meetings, lawyers, or raised voices. The former HOA president requested it herself. No demands. No threats. Just a message asking to talk. I agreed, not out of obligation, but because unresolved endings have a way of lingering longer than they should. She arrived guarded, not defiant like before. Power had been her armor, and without it, she seemed smaller, human in a way she hadn't allowed herself to be. She didn't apologize at first. Instead, she explained. Pressure. Expectations. The belief that strict control kept order. It was a familiar justification, one used by people who mistake authority for responsibility. When she finally mentioned the police call, her voice dropped. She admitted it was meant to scare me. A last move. She thought fear would restore balance. I told her calmly that fear never creates balance. It only delays collapse. That moment had cost her everything, not because of revenge, but because it revealed how far the board had drifted from its purpose. She asked if things could have ended differently. I said yes. If they'd listened sooner. If they'd questioned their own power. If intimidation hadn't become routine. Systems don't fail in one dramatic moment. They fail through 1,000 small choices made without reflection. There was no victory speech. No moral lecture. Just silence, and then understanding. She left knowing this wasn't a personal defeat. It was a structural one. And structures can be rebuilt, but only when people accept their flaws. That evening, I finalized the last transfer documents. Not to claim more control, but to dissolve what remained of the old framework completely. No loopholes. No shadows. The chapter was closing for real this time. Residents were notified one last time. The message was simple. The transition was complete. The protections were permanent. No authority could return without full, informed consent. No silent clauses. No surprise power shifts. Ever. I stood outside later, watching the sunset settle over the neighborhood. Kids rode bikes. Neighbors chatted. Life moved forward without needing permission. That was the real outcome. Not ownership on paper, but freedom in practice. What started with flashing police lights ended in something far quieter. Stability. Trust. Normalcy. The kind that doesn't make headlines but changes lives. And as I turned back inside, I realized the story wasn't about how I took control. It was about how control lost its grip. There was only one thing left to do. To explain why this mattered beyond one neighborhood. Because what happened here wasn't unique. It was just exposed. What happened in our neighborhood wasn't rare. It just reached its breaking point. Across countless communities, systems exist that began with good intentions and slowly hardened into instruments of control. Rules replace relationships. Authority replaces accountability. And fear becomes easier than trust. This story matters because it shows what happens when someone finally looks closely enough to notice the cracks. After everything settled, people kept asking how I knew where to look. The truth is, I didn't start with confidence. I started with curiosity. I asked why certain rules existed, why fines escalated so quickly, why no one questioned decisions anymore. Every system leaves a trail. You just have to follow it patiently instead of reacting emotionally. The HOA believed power was permanent because no one had challenged it before. That belief made them careless. They stopped reading. Stopped listening. Stopped checking foundations they assumed would hold forever. Power often collapses not because someone attacks it, but because it forgets it can be questioned. In the weeks that followed, I received messages from people in other neighborhoods. Similar stories. Similar intimidation. Similar silence. Some asked for legal advice. Others just wanted reassurance that they weren't crazy for feeling trapped. I told them the same thing. Start by understanding. Documents matter. Records matter. And fear only survives in the dark. This wasn't a blueprint for revenge. It wasn't about flipping ownership for profit or humiliation. It was about restoring balance. When systems forget who they serve, correction becomes necessary. Not loudly. Not violently. But firmly. The police call that night was meant to end the conversation. Instead, it started one that couldn't be controlled anymore. Intimidation exposed vulnerability. And vulnerability, once visible, changes everything. I didn't walk away with power in the way people assume. I walked away knowing power works best when it's limited, transparent, and replaceable. The moment authority becomes untouchable, it becomes dangerous. Today, the neighborhood is just a place again. Not a battleground. Not a hierarchy. Just homes, people, routines. That's the quiet success most never notice. And that's exactly how it should be. If there's one lesson to carry forward, it's this. Don't underestimate the strength of understanding what you've agreed to. Don't assume systems are fair just because they're familiar. And never believe fear is the final move. Because sometimes, the most powerful change begins with someone calmly reading what everyone else ignored. And when that happens, control doesn't explode. It simply disappears.